In the spring of 1878, the men of a small Ozark settlement dug 7 graves in the frozen clay above a hollow. Then they filled every one of them back in, empty. There were 7 bodies waiting in the cabin at the top of the cut: a father, a mother, an old woman, and 4 children. Every soul who had ever lived on that ground. The settlement had food enough to spare a day of labor. It had timber for 7 boxes, and a preacher willing to say the words over them. What it did not have, that spring, was one single man willing to put a Yeager into the earth. They would not bury them. And when you understand why, you will understand something worse. There is no Yeager grave anywhere in that county, no stone, no name cut into anything meant to last, because the ground above that hollow had been settled before the Yeagers ever came to it. It had ended before. And the people of the settlement were not the first to learn what the hollow does when you try to give it back what it believes it is owed. To find the hollow now, you would have to know it was there, and almost no one does. The maps drawn after that year do not show it. The road that once climbed to it was let go, and the timber came back over the ruts until the timber was all there was. But in 1878 there was a settlement at the mouth of that valley, a scatter of maybe 40 families along a creek the settlers called Pell, after the man who kept the store and the ledger, and when it came to it, the county book. Pell was not a rich place. It was a hard place made of people who had been pushed off better land somewhere behind them, and it sat where it sat because the bottoms along the creek were flat enough to work and the ridges gave timber and game. Nobody chose Pell. People arrived at Pell because they had run out of anywhere else to go. Above the settlement, the ground rose into a run of hollows, and most of them were claimed and worked within a few years of the first cabins going up. Men will take steep ground. They will take rocky ground and wet ground and ground that floods, if it is ground they can put their name to. But there was one piece above Pell that stayed empty long after everything around it had been taken, and the reason it stayed empty is the first thing you need to understand about what happened to the Yeagers. On the old survey, the piece was marked as a gore. That is a real word and a real thing. When surveyors run their lines across broken country, sometimes the lines do not close. The measurements leave a sliver, a wedge of land that belongs to no clean parcel, too narrow and too crooked to sell as a farm. Surveyors call that leftover wedge a gore, and most of the time a gore is nothing, a strip of brush along a boundary that gets folded into the neighbour's field and forgotten. But the gore above Pell was different. It was wide enough to hold a cabin and a garden and a little pasture. There was water. It had level ground under the trees. By every plain measure, it should have been taken in the first season, the way the hollows around it were taken, and it was not taken. Not that season, not for years after. The people of Pell went up into that gore for timber and for nothing else, and they came down again before dark, and if you asked one of them why no family had ever settled such a likely piece of ground, you would not get an answer that made sense. You would get a shrug. You would get the word unlucky. Or you would get an old man telling you that the ground up there did not hold, and refusing to say another word about what he meant by it. The Yeagers came to Pell in the autumn of 1876. They came the way most families came, worn down and short of money, with a wagon that had carried them further than it was built to carry. Enoch Yeager was a big man, quiet, older than his years, with a wife named Sarah and 4 children, and his own aged mother riding up front beside him under a pile of quilts. That was the whole family, 7 of them, and they were looking for ground. Now, a family arriving late at a place like Pell takes what is left, and what was left above Pell, the only piece a poor family could claim without paying a soul for it, was the gore. The men of the settlement told Enoch Yeager what they told everyone. The ground up there did not hold. It was unlucky. He would do better to move on down the creek and hire out for a season and wait for something in the bottoms to come open. Enoch Yeager listened to all of it. Then he asked one question, which the storeman remembered for the rest of his life because of how it sat with him afterward. He asked whether anyone owned the gore, whether there was a man in the county whose name was on it. And when they told him no, that it belonged to no one, that it had never belonged to anyone, something in his face eased, and he said he would take ground that belonged to no one over good bottoms that belonged to somebody else any day of his life. They should have heard the strangeness in that. A man will say he wants unclaimed land because it is free. He does not usually say he wants it because no one has ever owned it, as though the fact that the ground had refused every owner before him was a thing in its favour. But it was late in the year, and the Yeagers were plainly at the end of their money and their strength, and the people of Pell were not cruel people, only careful ones, and they let the family go up into the gore because the alternative was to watch them starve in the open. Enoch Yeager took his wagon up the cut in the last good week of that autumn, and for a little while everything about the Yeagers was ordinary. That first winter they kept to themselves, which no one thought strange, because a family with nothing spends its first winter simply trying to live through it. In the spring Enoch came down to Pell for seed and for salt and to trade a little work, and he was civil and slow-spoken and paid what he owed, and the storeman found nothing wrong with him except a habit the man could not name at the time and could only describe later. "Enoch Yeager," he said. Listen to the ground. He would stop in the middle of a sentence and go still, his head tilted, the way a man goes still when he hears a sound too low to place, and then after a moment he would come back to himself and finish what he had been saying as though nothing had happened. The storeman thought it was age, or grief, or some private trouble the family had carried in with them. He did not think it was the gore, not yet. Nobody thought about the gore when they looked at the Yeagers, in the beginning. That came later, and it came all at once. The children were seen through that first year, down at the creek, up along the timber, and they were thin the way all the children at Pell were thin, but they were children, and they laughed and ran, and did the things children do. The old woman was not seen at all, which no one questioned, because old women in that country often were not seen, kept back by the fire through the cold and too frail for the walk down the cut. Sarah Yeager came to the settlement twice that whole first year. She was a small, tired, watchful woman, and the wives of Pell tried to bring her into their circle the way settlements do, and she would not be brought. She thanked them and kept her distance and took her family back up the hollow, and the wives said among themselves that she was proud, or shy, or simply broken down by a hard life, and they let her be. It was in the second summer, the summer of 1878, that Enoch Yeager decided to dig a proper cellar under his cabin. He had wintered once in the gore and meant to winter better, and a cellar is a sensible thing, a cool hole for keeping, a place to put a family when the weather turns violent. So he dug, and a few feet down, in ground that should have been nothing but clay and chert and the roots of the timber, Enoch Yeager's spade struck stone. Not a boulder, not the loose rock that is in all that country. He struck a course of dressed stone. Cut stone, squared and set, laid in a line, the way a man lays a foundation. There was a wall under the gore, there was a floor. Something had been built on that ground, and built well, and built long enough ago, that the forest had grown up over it, and the memory of it had gone out of every living head. And when Enoch Yeager cleared the dirt off the top of that old floor and understood what he was looking at, the family changed. No one at Pell saw the old floor. That is worth holding on to, because everything anyone at Pell ever knew about what Enoch Yeager uncovered came second-hand, later, in pieces, from the little the family let slip and the much that the men guessed once it was too late to matter. But the change in the Yeagers, that was seen by everyone, and it started within days of the digging. Enoch stopped coming down for his trade. A season's worth of small debts at the store went unpaid, and this from a man who had never let a debt sit a week. When one of the Pell men rode up the cut to see whether the family was sick, he found Enoch out in the yard in the heat of the day, and Enoch would not let him near the cabin. He stood in the path and answered questions and gave nothing, and the man who had ridden up said afterward that the strangest part was not what Enoch said, but where he kept looking. All the while they talked, Enoch Yeager kept glancing down. Not at his feet, further down, at the ground, the way you would glance at a dog you were not sure of, a thing you had to keep half an eye on in case it moved. And behind him the cabin door stayed shut in the summer heat, and no smoke came from the chimney, though it was near the supper hour, and from somewhere the rider could not place, low and steady and wrong, there was a sound he did not have a word for, and did not try to describe until years had worn the shame off of it, at which point he said it had sounded like the ground breathing. The children were seen once more after that, and then not again. A woman gathering greens along the lower timber looked up and saw the four of them standing at the edge of the trees, up the slope, watching her. She lifted a hand to them the way you do with children, you know. They did not lift a hand back. They stood in a row and watched her with a stillness that no child has. that no living child can hold, and when she looked away and looked back, they were gone. Not run off, but gone, as though the trees had taken them in. She went home, and she did not go back to that timber for greens or for anything else, and she was one of the first to say out loud the thing that the whole settlement would soon be saying in the dark of their own cabins. Something had gotten into the Yeagers, something that lived in the gore, in the ground the surveyors could not close and no owner would keep, had been sleeping under that old cut floor since before the tribes, since before anyone, and Enoch Yeager had put his spade through the lid of it. And now it was awake. It was hungry now, and the family that had gone up the hollow looking for ground that belonged to no one had found out, too late, exactly why that ground had never belonged to anyone at all. For the rest of that summer, Pell watched the gore the way you watch a storm building over a ridge. Nobody went up. That was the first change in the settlement itself, and it happened without anyone deciding it. The path up the cut simply stopped being used. Men who had gone up for timber all their lives found reasons to cut elsewhere, and the reasons were always practical and always thin, and underneath every one of them was the same thing none of them would say, which was that the timber up there was no longer worth what it cost to be near the Yeager place. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the burial, the whole settlement refused to give the Yeagers the exact ground where the 7 were left through the thaw, the vote the men of Pell took by lamplight and how each hand fell, the names of the men who carried the refusal, and the single word the clerk set beside the family in the county book. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue, because things carried down from the gore now. On still nights, when the creek was low and the air did not move, sounds came down the hollow into Pell, and they were not the sounds a family makes. There was a knocking, slow and patient, that went on for hours and stopped near dawn. There came a sound like a great weight being dragged over stone, from a place where there was no stone that anyone knew of except the old floor no one at Pell had ever seen. And once, on a night, the whole lower settlement heard it, and talked about for years in the guarded way people talk about the thing that broke their nerve. There was a voice, an old woman's voice, thin and high, and going on in a rhythm that was almost words, coming down the cut from the direction of the Yeager cabin. The trouble with the voice was not that it was strange, though it was. The trouble was that by then everyone at Pell was fairly sure the old woman, Enoch's mother, had been dead since the spring. No one had seen her in more than a year. Sarah had said, the last time she came down, in a flat and careful way, that Mother Yeager had passed in the night and been laid to rest up on the place. And now the whole settlement lay awake in the dark and listened to a dead woman singing down the hollow, and not one of them could make out the words, and every one of them was grateful they could not. The Yeagers' stock had begun to die by then, or to leave. Their milk cow was found at the bottom of the cut one morning, down where the path met the creek, standing in the water and shaking and refusing to go back up. And when the Pell men tried to lead her further down to safety, she went into a terror so complete that they let her go rather than be trampled, and she ran off into the timber and was never caught. A family cannot live long without its animals. The men of Pell knew that. They knew the Yeagers were coming apart up there, sliding down into something none of them could look at directly, and the decent thing, the thing every man among them was raised to do, was to go up and bring the family out. And they did not do it. And the shame of not doing it is the reason so much of this was never written down. Twice that autumn, men went part way up. The first time, 3 of them started up the cut with rifles and the intention of reaching the cabin and seeing the family with their own eyes, and they got perhaps 2/3 of the way when the lead man stopped and would not go on. He never gave a full account of what turned him. What little he said was that the timber had gone silent, all of it at once, no birds and no insects and no wind, a silence with a pressure to it, and that up ahead through the trees he had seen the Yeager children standing in the path facing down toward him, all 4 in a row, not moving, waiting, and that the wrongness of how they stood had gone through him like cold water, and he had understood, in a way that had nothing to do with thinking, that if he took one more step up that path he would not be coming back down it. The 3 men returned to Pell. They were not cowards. 2 of them had fought in the war, and one had buried 3 of his own children with his own hands, and none of them shamed easily, and all three came down that cut white and silent, and did not speak of it for the rest of the day. The second time the settlement sent the preacher. His name does not survive, only that he was a circuit man, that he came through Pell 3 or 4 times a year, and that when they told him what was happening in the gore, he did what such men were trained to do and set his face against it and went up alone with his book. He was gone a long time. When he came back down he was changed, and he left Pell that same evening, though the light was already failing, and he did not come back through on his circuit again, not that year, and not ever. Before he went he said one thing to the storeman, who wrote it in the margin of his ledger because he did not know where else to put it, and it is one of the few things from that time that survives in anything like the man's own words. The preacher said that whatever was in the Yeager cabin was not the family, that the family was mostly gone by then, used up, and that the thing wearing what was left of them had spoken to him out of Enoch Yeager's mouth in a voice like a room with no floor, and had told him that it had been under that ground a long time, that it had been given people before and would be given people again, and that the only question the settlement had left to decide was not whether it would be fed, but how. And then the preacher rode out of Pell into the dark, rather than spend one more night within the sound of that hollow, and the men he left behind understood that they had been told something, a warning or a sentence, and that they were on their own with it. Winter came down early and hard that year, the way it does in that country when it means to, and the snow closed the cut, and for a few weeks Pell was able to tell itself a story that let it sleep. The story was that the Yeagers were dead, that the family had starved or frozen or fallen to whatever sickness had taken hold up there, and that the sounds had stopped because the thing that made them had finished, and that in the spring the men would go up and find bones and bury them, and the gore would go back to being an empty wedge of ground on a map, unlucky and nothing more. It was a comforting story, and the settlement wanted badly to believe it, and for a while the hollow let them, because the sounds did stop. Through the deep of that winter the nights above Pell were silent, and a silent hollow was the most any of them dared to hope for. But the story had a hole in it, and the hole was this. Twice in the worst of the cold, in the blue light before dawn, people at the upper end of the settlement saw a figure come part way down the cut and stand at the tree line and look down on Pell, and then go back up. It was too far and too dark to say who it was or even what it was, only that it was upright and it was patient, and it stood in snow to the knee without any sign of the cold that would have killed a living person in minutes. The figure did not come down into the settlement. It never came down. Instead, it stood at the edge of the timber where the gore ended and Pell began, on the line between the ground that belonged to no one and the ground the settlers had made their own, and it looked at them, and then it withdrew. And every soul who saw it understood that the family was not finished after all, that something was still up there, keeping watch through the dead of winter, waiting for the thaw the same as they were, and that whatever was decided in the spring would have to be decided with that thing awake and watching from the tree line. By the end of that winter, Pell was a settlement holding its breath. The families at the upper end moved down to crowd in with kin at the lower end, so as not to sleep alone within sight of the cut. Guns were kept loaded by every door, which was nothing new in that country, except that no one could have told you what they meant to shoot. And the men talked, in the store, in the evenings, in low voices, with the door barred, about what would have to be done when the snow let go. They talked in circles. They talked around the centre of it. But under all the talking was a decision already forming, the way ice forms, out of sight and all at once. And the decision was that when the thaw came, they would go up, all of them together in daylight with every weapon they had, and they would see for themselves what was left in the Yeager cabin, and they would settle it. The thaw came in the 3rd week of what would have been spring, though in that country the calendar and the weather rarely agree. The snow went off the south slopes first, then the cut, and the creek came up brown and loud with it. On the first morning the path was open. Near 30 men of Pell went up the hollow together. They had planned it for weeks, and they went the way they had planned, in a body, in full daylight, armed, with the storeman keeping a kind of count, and a young man carrying an axe against whatever door might have to come down. They went up slow. The timber that had gone silent for the 3 men in the autumn was not silent now. Birds were in it, and the melt was running everywhere, and some of the men let themselves believe, on the way up, that the ordinariness of it meant the worst was over, that they would find only the dead and the work of burying them. They did not find only the dead. What they found in the yard of the Yeager place stopped the whole body of them at the edge of the clearing, and more than one man among them, grown men who had seen the war, turned aside and was sick in the brush. The cabin still stood. The garden was a ruin of the year before, gone to weed and rot under the retreating snow, and the cellar Yeager had dug the summer before, the hole where his spade had struck the old floor, was open to the sky and far larger than any one man could have dug, wide as the cabin itself, and the dirt from it was thrown up around the edges in a way that made no sense, as though the digging had come from below and not above. From that opening, faint in the cold air, rose a smell that several of the men would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget, and never once succeed. They stood at the edge of the clearing, and they looked at the open ground and the silent cabin, and every instinct in them said to turn and go back down, and they did not, because they had come to settle it, and there is a kind of courage that is only the inability to face one's neighbours having run. The cabin door was barred from the inside. The young man with the axe put it down in 3 blows, and the men went in with their guns, up into a dark that the daylight behind them could not seem to fill, and there, in the one room of the Yeager cabin, they found the family, all 7 of them, the 4 children, and Sarah, and the old woman who had been dead for a year and was in no grave, and Yeager at the head of his own table. 7 of them, seated, in their places, around a table set as if for a meal, in a room that had been closed and barred from within. And there is no natural way that could have been. A room cannot be barred from the inside and then left with every soul in it dead in their chairs. Someone living has to drop the bar. But the bar was down, and the family was seated, and not one of them had been alive for a long time, and the wrongness of that arrangement, the deliberate and impossible care of it, was the thing that broke Pell's nerve for good and set in motion everything the settlement did next. It took the men a while to understand what they were looking at, and understanding it was worse than the first shock had been. The 7 Yeagers had been dead a long time, that much was plain. But they had not rotted the way the dead rot. The cold might account for some of it. A body keeps through a hard winter in a way it never would in summer, but this was past what the cold could do. The family sat dried and drawn and dark, the skin gone tight over the bone, more like things carved out of old wood than like people who had died. And yet they were not fallen or slumped or disarranged as the long dead always are. They sat upright. They sat composed. Their hands were on the table. And their faces, every one of the 7, from the old woman down to the smallest child, were turned toward the head of the table where Enoch sat, as though in the last of whatever had happened to them they had all been looking at him, or at something behind him, or at something that had been standing where he was. There was food on the table, or what had been food, gone to a black ruin in the dishes. There was a lamp burned dry, and in the middle of the floor, behind Enoch's chair, the boards had been taken up, and there was a hole cut down through them into the dark below, down toward the old floor and the thing beneath it, and the edges of that hole were worn smooth, worn the way a threshold wears, the way stone wears under 100 years of feet, as though there had been a great deal of passing back and forth through that opening in the floor of a cabin that had stood for less than 2 years. One of the men held his lamp down into the hole. He did not hold it there long. He said afterward only that the dark under the Yeager cabin did not end where a cellar should end, that it went down and it went back, farther than the hill could hold, and that while he knelt there with his lamp he had the certain feeling of having been looked at from a long way off by something that was in no hurry, and that the feeling was worse than any fear he had known in the war, because fear in the war had at least believed it might be spared, and this feeling did not believe anything of the kind. It simply knew it had been seen, and filed away, and would be come back to. They did not stay in that cabin longer than it took to see what was in it. Whatever courage had carried 30 men up the hollow did not extend to standing in that room with those 7 faces and that worn hole in the floor, and they went out into the daylight fast and close together, and some of them were praying, and some were past praying, and the storeman got them into a body again at the edge of the clearing by main force of will, because he understood that a panic on that path would kill someone. They stood in the ruined yard, and they made themselves think, and the thinking led them, every one of them, to the same place, and it was not the place they had come up expecting. They had come up to bury the Yeagers. That had been the plan for weeks, spoken and settled, the decent Christian end to a terrible thing. Go up, find the dead, dig the graves, say the words, come down and let the gore close over the whole business. But standing in that yard, looking at the open cellar that had dug itself wider than any grave, looking back through the broken door at the family seated around the meaning of it, the men of Pell understood something they had no words for and would struggle the rest of their lives to say. They understood that the thing under the gore had not simply killed the Yeagers. It had kept them, it had arranged them, and it had dried them and seated them and turned their faces and left the door barred from the inside as a message, and the message was for whoever came up the hollow next, and the message was an invitation. The bodies were not the end of what had happened in the gore. The bodies were bait, and to take those 7 and lower them into the ground, into the very ground that had done this, to open the earth of that place with a spade, the way Enoch Yeager had opened it, and put the family down into the dark that had been passing back and forth through the floor of their cabin, was not to bury them at all. It was to feed them in. It was to finish the thing the way the thing wanted it finished, to complete with their own hands the last motion of a ritual that had been going on under that hill since before their people crossed the water. And the men of Pell, standing in that yard in the cold spring light, made a decision that their descendants would call cruelty and cowardice and madness for as long as the story was told at all, and that was none of those things. They decided that whatever else they did, they would not put the Yeagers into the ground. They would not dig one spadeful of that gore, nor give the hollow the burial it was so plainly waiting for. And then they went down to Pell to argue out, through one long lamplit night, exactly what a settlement does with 7 bodies it has sworn it will never bury. It is easy, now, from a warm room in a safe sanctuary, to hear that decision and recoil from it. 7 people, 4 of them children, denied the ground and the words and the small human mercy of a marked grave. It sounds like the worst thing a frightened settlement could do, and for a long time that is how the little of it that survived was understood, on the rare occasions it was spoken of at all. A family went strange up a hollow, and a hard and superstitious people let them die and then would not even bury them. That is the shape the story takes when you know only the outside of it. But the men who came down that cut knew the inside of it. They had stood in the room, they had looked into the hole in the floor and felt themselves be seen. And what they carried down to Pell that afternoon was not superstition and was not cruelty. It was the same knowledge, arrived at the same way, that had emptied that gore of every owner before them, and it was about to make them do a thing that would seal the hollow and damn their own names in the same single motion. Before we move on to the vote, the men of Pell took that night stop for a second. What you just heard about what the search party found in the Yeager cabin is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the county's own book. 7 at the table. The bar on the inside. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. They argued until the lamps burned low. The whole settlement crowded into and around the store, which was the only building at Pell big enough to hold them, and the only place with the county book in it. And they argued the way people argue when every choice in front of them is a bad one, and doing nothing is the worst choice of all. There were men who said the decision made on the hill was madness, that you cannot leave the dead unburied, that whatever was up there, the bodies at least were only bodies and owed the ground. There were men who had been in the cabin and could not be moved by any argument at all, who said simply that they had seen it and the others had not, and that was the end of it. And there were the women, who in that country did not vote, and whose word in a matter like this carried more than any vote, and the women had heard the dead grandmother singing down the cut all through the summer, and they were not confused about what was up there and what it wanted, and they came down on the side of the men who had been in the room. But the thing that decided it, in the end, was not the argument. It was the storeman, who was also the man who kept the county book, and who had written in his own ledger the thing the preacher told him before he fled. He got up near the middle of the night and he read that margin note out loud to the whole settlement. The preacher's own words about the thing that had spoken from Enoch Yeager's mouth, that it had been given people before, and would be given people again, and that the only question was not whether it would be fed, but how. And when he had read it, he said that the gore had swallowed a settlement once already, long enough ago that only the old floor was left of it, and that the burying was how you fed it, the burying was the door, and that every people who had ever tried to close that ground the honest way, with graves and words, had only opened it wider. He said the reason the gore had stood empty all those years, the reason no owner had ever kept it, was that somewhere in the bones of that country the knowledge had survived, worn down to a shrug, and the word unlucky, that you do not settle the gore, and you do not, whatever else you do, bury your dead in it. The Yeagers had not known. They had come from far away, late and poor and ignorant of the ground, and they had settled the one place a stranger would settle and dug the one hole a stranger would dig. But Pell knew now. Pell had been taught the way the ground teaches, and the storeman said that to bury those 7 would be to throw away the lesson and hand the hollow exactly the thing it had killed a whole family to get. So they voted. By a show of hands in the low lamplight, near 40 households of a dying Ozark settlement voted on whether to bury 7 of their own dead, and the hands that said no outnumbered the hands that said yes by more than 2 to 1, and the storeman counted them and wrote the count in the county book because he was the man whose job it was to write things in the book. Beside the Yeager name, where a clerk would ordinarily write the fact and date of a death, he wrote the count of the vote, and then, under it, alone on its own line, he wrote a single word to stand for what the settlement had decided to do instead of burying them. The word was not a word you would expect. It was not a curse or a prayer. It was the plainest word a man could choose, and it was somehow the most terrible for being so plain. He wrote the word kept, and then he closed the book, and the men went home to sleep the little that was left of that night, and in the morning they began the work of doing to the Yeagers the thing that would keep Pell out of the ground for as long as Pell lasted, which as it turned out was not very long at all. What they did in one day, and they did it in daylight with the whole body of the men present, because no one would go up that hollow alone, and no one would stay behind alone either. They went up with tools, but not with spades for digging graves. They went up with stone. The plan, argued out in the last hour before dawn, was neither burial nor abandonment. They would not put the Yeagers in the ground, but they would not leave them seated at that table for the hollow to display to the next traveller either. The cabin would come down on top of them. They would pull the walls in and pile the whole ruin over the 7 where they sat, and then they would cover the ruin with stone, every stone they could carry, and lever and roll, until there was a cairn over the Yeager place that no Thor would shift and no thing from below could easily push aside, and they would seal in particular the hole in the floor, the worn opening down toward the old cut floor, under the heaviest stone they had. It was not a grave, that was the whole point of it. A grave is a door you open and then close. What they built was a lid, and a lid is a thing you never open at all. But before they could begin, one of the younger men, either braver than the rest, or less able to bear the waiting, took a spade after all and began to dig at the edge of the clearing, meaning to make at least one honest grave for at least the smallest child, unable in his heart to do the thing the settlement had voted for. He got down perhaps 2 feet, and the hole he dug filled, not with water, though the ground was wet with melt. It filled from the sides and from the bottom, the loosened earth sliding back in faster than he could throw it out, as though the gore would not hold an opening, as though the ground closed every wound you tried to make in it. And the more he dug, the more it came back, and the men stood and watched him fight the earth for a grave the earth would not allow, and one by one they understood that the storeman had been right about everything. You could not bury in the gore. The gore would not be buried into. It took openings, and it closed them on its own terms, down and back into the dark, and the young man dropped his spade and backed away from the little that was left of his 2 feet of hole, which was already filling, already smoothing over, already going back to unbroken ground, as if he had never touched it, and he did not pick up a spade again that day. After that no one argued for graves. They built the lid. They worked until dark and came back the next day and worked again, and it took the better part of a week to raise the cairn the way they wanted it, and the whole time they worked they felt themselves watched, from the tree line, from the timber, from the open cellar mouth, before they got it sealed. Nothing came at them, nothing had to. The hollow had all the time there was, and it stood back and let the men of Pell build their lid, and if a thing that has been under a hill since before the tribes can be said to be patient, then it was patient, and if it can be said to be amused, then some of the men swore afterward that it was that too. They finished the cairn. They put the last and heaviest stone over the place where the hole had been, and they came down the cut for what most of them swore would be the last time, and they told themselves it was done, and it was not done. because a lid keeps a thing in, but it does not make the thing leave, and Pell had sealed the hollow without ever once making it let go. The men who built that lid did not speak of it afterward, and that silence is its own part of the record. They came down off the gore that last evening and did not tell their wives what the inside of the cabin had held, and they told the children nothing at all, and when a man from another settlement came asking, years on, about the family said to have died up the hollow, they answered that the Yeagers had taken sick and moved on west, which was the same lie the Yeagers had told about the girl at the tree line, the same lie the hollow seemed to teach every mouth that got close to it. What little came down to us came down crooked, in half sentences, let slip late at night by old men who had been boys that spring. In a margin note a storeman could not bring himself to leave out of his ledger, in the shape of a thing rather than the thing itself. That is how the truth about ground like that always travels. Not in a paper you can hold, but in a reluctance, a lowered voice, a subject a whole family will steer around at the supper table for 4 generations without any of them quite knowing why. The men of Pell did not only refuse the Yeagers a grave, they refused the whole story a place to rest, and they were right to, because a story like that one, told plainly and often, is only another kind of road up the hollow, another way of pointing the next stranger straight at the gore. For a few weeks it seemed to hold. The nights were quiet. No figure stood at the tree line in the dawn, no voice came down the cut, and Pell allowed itself, one more time, to believe it had done the thing that would let it go on living where it lived. That belief lasted until the ground finished thawing, because when the deep frost came out of the hillside, the cairn began to move, not to fall. The men had built it too well for that. It moved the way the storeman came to dread most, which was down and inward and slow. The great pile of stone the men of Pell had raised over the Yeager place began, over that spring and into the summer, to sink. Its centre went down first, the heaviest stones easing into the ground under their own weight, the way stones do not, drawing the rest after them, so that by high summer the proud cairn the settlement had sweated a week to build was a shallow bowl of stone in the earth, and by the next spring it was a depression you could have missed in the timber, and within a few years there was nothing to show that anything had ever been built there at all except a smoothness in the ground, a wrongness in the way the land lay, that made the eye slide off of it, and the feet want to be elsewhere. The gore took the cairn the same way it had taken the grave the young man tried to dig, the same way it had taken the old floor and the settlement that floor belonged to, down and back and under, into the keeping that the storeman had written one plain word to name. The hollow did not spit the Yeagers out, and it did not let them rest. It kept them, the way it had said through the preacher's mouth that it would, and the lid the men built became just one more layer of the thing that ground had been doing to people for longer than anyone at Pell could imagine. And Pell began to empty, not in a panic. The country was too hard for panic, and a family cannot simply walk away from the only ground it has. It emptied the way such places empty, one household at a time, over 3 or 4 years, each leaving for a reason that had nothing to do with the gore, a marriage, a death, a better piece of bottom land 2 counties over, a chance to go in with a brother out west. Every reason was ordinary, and every reason was true, and underneath all of them was the thing no one would say, which was that no one wanted to raise children within sight of that cut, within earshot of that hollow, on ground that shared a hillside with a place the earth was so plainly, so patiently, drawing down into itself. The storeman was among the last to go. He kept the store and the book until there was almost no one left to keep them for, and then he packed the book in with his household goods, the county book with the Yeager vote, and the one plain word in it, and he took it away with him, which is the reason it was never in any courthouse and never entered any public record, and survives, if it survives at all, only as a thing described by people who described the man who claimed to have seen it. And when the storeman left, Pell was finished. The creek kept its name for a while on the maps, and then lost even that. Its cabins fell in, the bottoms went back to brush, and the hollow above, the gore that could not be closed and would not be kept out of and had swallowed everything anyone ever tried to give it, went back to being what it had been before the Yeagers and before Pell and before the tribes and before, for all anyone knows, before there were people in that country at all. It went back to being empty. It went back to waiting, because emptiness and waiting, as the whole miserable history of that ground shows, are only the same thing seen at 2 different speeds. Here is where the story stops, being only the story of one poor family, and becomes something larger and colder. And here is where you have to set aside, for a moment, the 7 at the table, and think instead about the ground itself and what the record of that ground does and does not contain. There is no gore on the maps of that county now. Go and look, if you can find the county at all in the tangle of lines those old surveys became. The wedge of unclosed land above where Pell used to be, the sliver too crooked to sell, the piece marked on the first survey with the surveyor's own hand as a gore, is simply not there on the surveys that came after. The lines that once left that leftover wedge were redrawn to close it, absorbed into the parcels on either side, so that on paper the ground lies flat and whole and accounted for, and there was never any leftover piece at all. Surveyors will tell you this happens, that early surveys were rough, and later ones corrected them, and that is true, and it is the kind of true that is used to cover a great many things, because it is a strange correction that erases the one piece of ground a whole settlement died refusing to bury its dead in. It is a strange accident that closes, on paper, exactly the wound in the earth that would not close in fact. The gore was taken off the map the same spring the Yeagers were kept, by men who had every reason to want no line on any paper pointing at that hillside, and once it was off the map it was off the mind, and once it was off the mind the only thing left to remember it was the ground, and the ground does not use maps. And this, if you have the stomach to follow it, is the pattern that should keep you up at night, because the gore above Pell was not the first ground to be quietly closed on paper over a thing that would not close in fact, and the old cut floor Enoch Yeager struck with his spade is the proof of it. Someone built on that ground before. Someone dressed and squared and laid that stone, in courses, a foundation and a floor, work that takes numbers and a plumb and a settled people with time and skill to spare, and then that someone was gone so completely that the forest closed over the work and the memory went out of every head, and the very people who lived at the mouth of that hollow did not know there was a floor under the gore until a stranger dug down and found it. A whole settling of that ground, ended and buried and forgotten under a wedge of leftover land that later maps would erase a second time. How many times, you have to ask, has that hollow been settled and swallowed and smoothed over and taken off the record? How many floors are down there under the one Enoch found? How many lids under his lid? How many plain words in how many lost books, each written by the last frightened clerk of the last dying settlement to learn what that ground teaches? The Yeagers thought they were the first people to break that soil. They were only the most recent, and the men of Pell, who redrew the survey and carried off the book and let the cabins fall, thought they were hiding a shameful thing they had done. They were doing, without knowing it, the exact thing that had been done to hide the settlement before them, and the settlement before that, closing the ground on paper because they could not close it in the earth, adding one more layer of forgetting to a place that had been forgotten and refound and forgotten again more times than any map has ever been allowed to show. Stand back from it now, as far back as you can bear to stand, and look at the whole shape of the thing, because the shape is the horror, and the details are only how the shape reaches up into a single human year and takes hold of a single human family. There is a floor under that hollow older than the tribes. Above the floor there was a settlement, no living memory recorded, ended so thoroughly that only the stone survived. Above that vanished settlement the surveyors of a later people ran their lines and could not make them close, and left a gore, a wound, a piece that would not fit, and marked it, and shrugged at it, and warned each other away from it, in words worn down to nothing. Then came the Yeagers, above the gore, who did not know the warning, and who dug, and who were kept. And above the Yeagers came the men of Pell, who sealed and redrew and carried off the book and forgot, and who are themselves now so far gone that the creek has lost its name, and the county has lost its shape, and you would not find the place if you spent a year looking. Layer over layer over layer, settling and swallowing and smoothing and forgetting, each people certain they were the first to touch that ground, each people learning, if they learned anything at all before the end, that they were only the newest mouthful. And under all of it, unchanged, unhurried, uninterested in the calendars and the maps and the plain frightened words that its brief tenants scratch into their brief books, the thing that the ground is, doing what it has always done, which is to take what settles on it, keep what settles on it, and let the surface heal so smooth and so complete that the next people to come will look at a green and level and likely piece of empty ground and think, as every people before them thought, that it is simply waiting to be theirs. That is what the fear of that country is really about, when you strip the folklore off of it and look at the bone underneath. It is not ghosts. Ghosts are the dead who cannot leave. This is worse than the dead who cannot leave. This is ground that will not let go. Ground that heals over its wounds and erases its own scars and rewrites the maps of the people who try to record it. Ground that has outlived so many settlings that the very idea of before, the very notion that history runs back in one clean line to a first cabin and a first survey, and a beginning you can name, is a comfort the ground allows its tenants for exactly as long as it takes to fatten them. The old floor is the tear in that comfort. Somebody was here before, and did good work, and is gone with their name and their language and their entire world under a wedge of land later maps would swallow twice. The Yeagers found the tear. The men of Pell papered over it. And you are hearing about it now only because the paper never quite holds, because a storeman carried off a book, because the story leaked out sideways through the descendants of frightened men and worked its way down 150 years into the reach of your ears, which is the one place the ground cannot heal over, the one wound it cannot close, the telling of it, the fact that somebody, somewhere, still knows there was a gore. Go back, one last time, to the thing at the bottom of all of it. The floor. Because everything else in this story is people reacting to the floor, and the floor is the only piece of the whole account that a person could, in theory, still go and put a hand on, if a person were foolish enough to find the gore and dig. The little that survives about what Enoch Yeager uncovered, filtered through the men who glimpsed the open cellar before they sealed it, and the storeman who wrote down what he could, does not describe a rough thing. It does not describe the piled field stone a settler stacks for a hearth or the crude footing a cabin sits on. What those men saw was dressed stone, squared true, laid in even courses, fitted so close that they said you could not have slid a knife between the blocks, and cut from a stone that was not the chert and the sandstone of that country, but something darker and heavier that no one could name the source of. The floor itself was flat, dead flat, flatter than the men had tools to make, running back into the dark under the hill farther than a cabin's footprint could account for, so that whatever had stood on that floor had been far larger than the Yeager cabin, larger than anything at Pell, larger than the church 2 counties over. That was the biggest building any of those men had ever stood inside. Somebody built big on that ground once. Somebody built big and built fine and built to last, with skill and numbers and a settled patience that the poor scrabbling people who came after, the tribes and the Yeagers and the men of Pell alike, could only have looked at and failed to understand. And then that somebody was taken down into the same dark that took everyone after them, and the forest grew, and the ground healed, and the world moved on with no memory that the builders had ever been, until a tired stranger looking for land no one else would take put a spade through their ceiling and let the dark back up into the light. This is the peace that people cannot sit with, and it is the peace that matters most. We tell the history of that country as though it began with the first settlers, or, if we are being generous, with the tribes who were there before them. We draw the line back that far, and we call it the beginning, and we build our whole sense of the place on it. But the floor under the gore does not fit on that line. The floor is older than the beginning we allow ourselves. The floor belongs to a settling of that ground so far back and so completely erased that it left no story, no name, no people, nothing but squared stone under a wedge of land that the maps would go on to swallow twice. And the only reason we know it existed at all is that the ground, for once, in one hollow, failed to heal fast enough, and a family paid for the gap with their lives, and a settlement paid for it with its existence, and the plain word got written in a book. A frightened man carried off into the dark of ordinary history, where it has been waiting, like the ground, like everything about that place, to be found again. People have gone looking for the gore. Not many, and not recently, but over the years a few, the way a few always go looking for the places at the bottom of stories like this one. They have the fragments to work from, the same fragments you have now, an Ozark settlement called Pell that is on no current map, a creek that lost its name, a family named Yeager that appears in no death record because their deaths were written as a vote in a book a storeman carried off, a wedge of land that a first survey called a gore and every later survey closed. It is not much to go on. And the country up there is the kind that swallows the people who go into it lightly, steep and grown over and trackless, hollow folding into hollow until a man who knows the woods can lose the direction of his own truck. Most who have gone looking have simply not found it, and have come back and said the ground defeated them, that the hollows would not line up with the old descriptions, that they walked what should have been the place and found only more timber, and have gone home and let it go. But a handful have said something else, and it is the handful that matter. They have said they found a hollow that felt like the one, wide enough and watered and level under the trees, the likely empty piece the story describes, ground you would settle in a heartbeat if you did not know better. And they have said that somewhere near the head of it, back where a cabin would have stood, there is a place where the land lies wrong, a smoothness, a shallow, sunken evenness in the earth, grown over like everything else and yet not like everything else, that the eye slides off of and the feet do not want to approach, and that, if you stand on it, feels very slightly hollow underfoot, feels, one of them said, and then wished he had not, like standing on the lid of something. None of them dug. Every one of them says the same thing about why they did not dig, which is that standing on that ground, in that hollow, with the light going and the timber gone quiet, the very last thing in the world any of them wanted was to open the earth of that place and let whatever the men of Pell spent a week of their lives sealing back up into the light. They came away. They left the ground the way the story begs you to leave it, closed, kept, healing, and that, in the end, may be the only wisdom the whole terrible account has to offer. There are places that were settled before the beginning we allow ourselves. There are floors under the floor of history, and the people who lived at the mouth of the worst of them learned, at a cost you and I can barely stand to look at, that the one thing you must never do with such ground, whatever else your decency demands, is give it a body and open it the door. So there is no grave to visit. That is the thing to carry out of this, the thing that stays with you after the fear of the cabin and the 7 at the table and the singing down the cut has faded to a story you can tell at a fire. There is no Yeager grave, and there was never meant to be one, and the absence of it is not neglect and is not cruelty. It is the most deliberate act the people of Pell ever performed. They looked at 7 of their own dead, 4 of them children, and they understood that the ordinary mercy, the ground and the words and the marked stone, was in this one case the door to something that would take the mercy and the mourners and the whole settlement down into the dark behind it, and they chose, at the price of their own good names in whatever version of the story survived them, to withhold that mercy and seal the door instead. They were not good men that spring. There is no version of this in which they were good men. But they may have been right, and the difference between a good man and a right one, on ground like that, in a year like that, is a difference the rest of us are lucky enough to have never had to weigh. It is tempting to file all of this under superstition and be done with it, the way the descendants of Pell did for as long as they could, the way we all do with the parts of the past that will not sit quietly in the shape we have made for it. A hard people, a strange family, a bad winter, a shameful thing done out of fear. That is a story a person can live beside. But superstition does not redraw surveys. It does not lay dressed stone under a wedge of forgotten land and then vanish without a name. And it does not fill a 2-foot grave from the bottom faster than a strong young man can empty it, in front of 30 witnesses, in the cold light of a spring morning. Something happened on that ground that the comfortable word superstition was invented precisely to help us not look at, and the men who were there did not have the luxury of the word, because they were standing in the thing the word is meant to cover. They saw the ground refuse a grave. They built a lid instead. And every choice they made after that, every stone they carried and every line they redrew and every mile the storeman put between himself and that hollow with the book packed in his wagon, was the choice of people who had stopped being able to pretend. You can call that fear if you like, and part of it was fear. But fear runs, and these men did not run. They stayed on that hillside a full week with a thing watching them from the tree line, and they did not come down off it until the work was wholly finished. Think about that the next time you stand on a piece of empty ground that seems, for no reason you can name, to be waiting. Most empty ground is only empty. Most of it is exactly what it looks like, a field, a wood, a wedge of land between two lines on a map, nothing under it but roots and rock and the plain history of the country. But not all of it. Somewhere, out there, in that broken Ozark country, and in 100 quiet places like it, the ground lies smooth over floors that were laid before the beginning, we tell ourselves. Over settlings that ended so completely they took their own names with them, over the plain last words of frightened clerks in books that were carried off into the dark and lost. The maps close over those places. The surveys absorb them. And the very shape of the land smooths and heals and forgets, because forgetting is the last and best thing the ground does to the people it keeps. And the only wound it cannot heal, the one tear it cannot close, is the one you are standing in right now. Somebody remembered, somebody carried a book, and somebody let the story leak sideways down 150 years until it reached you, here, tonight, so that for as long as you carry it, there is one place in the world, the ground above that hollow does not own, and that place is the knowing. Keep it. Whatever else you do with this, keep the knowing, and stay off the gore. And if you ever find yourself on ground that lies too smooth and too likely and too patiently empty, ground that feels the faintest bit hollow under your feet, do the one thing the men of Pell learned to do at a price you would not want to pay. Leave it closed. Leave it kept. And walk back down the way you came while the way is still there to walk.